On April 5, 1909, a Phoenix newspaper printed a story Arizona has never fully put to rest. A hidden citadel, carved into stone deep inside the Grand Canyon, filled with tunnels, chambers, and artifacts belonging to a civilization no history book has ever accounted for. The story disappeared from public record almost as quickly as it surfaced. What almost nobody has connected to it is a passage written nearly 2,000 years earlier, in a book the Church removed from the Bible, describing a sealed structure at the far edge of the known world, holding something bound until judgment, guarded by a seal set before the thing it seals even existed. The Book of Enoch was removed from Scripture by the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. For 17 centuries, the Church called it forbidden and dangerous, and buried in its oldest surviving chapters is a description some readers, more than 1,000 years later, couldn't stop connecting to a canyon on the opposite side of the world from where the text was written. If the kind of pattern that shouldn't line up, but somehow does, is exactly what keeps you watching past the point where most people click away, hit subscribe now. Every week we go back into these manuscripts and sit with the questions nobody's fully answered. And if you already know the 1909 story I'm about to walk through, tell me in the comments, because it's stranger than most people remember it being. Chapters 17 and 18 of Enoch open with Enoch being carried westward. Then further still, past every region a Second Temple audience would have recognized as part of the known world, to what the text calls the ends of the earth. That phrase wasn't decoration in the cosmology of the time. It meant the outer limit of the map, the point at which ordinary geography stopped being able to describe what was there, and something else took over. Enoch is shown mountains of stone, storehouses of hoarfrost, and a cold the text insists has no comparison anywhere in the inhabited world. The writer goes out of his way, more than once, to tell us this place doesn't behave like anywhere else on the map he otherwise seems to know in careful detail. That insistence itself is worth noticing. Writers don't usually repeat, "This is different," unless they expect the reader to assume otherwise. Chapters 24 and 25 slow the account down and get specific in a way the rest of the journey doesn't bother to. 7 mountains, arranged deliberately, one at the center, described in the text as a throne, the other 6 surrounding it, each one made of a different named stone. Each stone apparently significant enough to record individually. This isn't the language of a traveler describing scenery he happened to stumble onto. It reads closer to someone describing a layout, the way you'd describe the rooms of a building, not the contours of a landscape you were simply passing through. A fragrant tree stands beside the central mountain, and the text lingers on it longer than it lingers on almost anything else in the passage, noting that it is reserved for a future time and not accessible now. Structure, deliberate arrangement, and restricted access, all folded into the same few verses. None of that reads like an afterthought a writer included just to add color. Chapter 18 then takes a sharper, stranger turn. Beyond the 7 mountains, Enoch is shown what the text calls an abyss, and it specifies something almost nobody expects a 2,000-year-old religious text to bother specifying this precisely. This place has no firmament above it, and no earth founded beneath it. No sky, no ground. The more literal manuscript renderings go further, describing a place with no water and no birds. Nothing that belongs to the ordinary living world at all, not even the smallest signs of it. Waste and horrible, the text calls it, and the phrasing doesn't read like a metaphor for punishment in the way later Christian hell imagery usually does. It reads like a description of physical absence, the deliberate removal of the basic features that define every other place Enoch visits on his journey. A location defined entirely by what isn't there. And there, in that empty place, Enoch says he sees 7 stars, bound together, described as burning like great mountains, not falling, not streaking across the sky, the way a meteor would be described elsewhere in ancient literature. Bound, a word the text uses in other passages specifically for imprisonment, not for any natural celestial event. The angel Uriel identifies them as beings who transgressed the commandment before their appointed rising, held for what the text calls 10,000 years, until the time of their guilt is completed. Not eternity in the vague, unbounded sense most churches have taught for centuries. A specific, numbered sentence, set, apparently, by someone who already knew exactly how long the containment needed to last. A number like that doesn't usually appear in a text, unless the writer believed it mattered. Before we keep going, if a detail like a numbered sentence, tucked inside a passage about eternity, is the kind of thing that makes you stop and reread a paragraph twice, subscribe and like this video right now. It's the only way research like this actually reaches the people who want to sit with it. And tell me in the comments, does a fixed number like that sound like poetry to you? Or does it sound like a countdown? Here's where this gets stranger. On April 5, 1909, the Arizona Gazette published an article claiming an archaeologist named G.E. Kincaid, working under the Smithsonian Institution, had discovered a vast underground citadel deep inside the Grand Canyon. Carved chambers, tunnels stretching for miles, artifacts belonging to a civilization with no established place in the historical record. No Kincaid has ever been confirmed to exist in any verifiable Smithsonian record. No follow-up article ever ran in the paper. The Smithsonian has denied any connection to the discovery, both at the time and in every decade since. Most historians treat the piece as a hoax, and the surrounding evidence supports that conclusion completely. But the story never fully died the way most retracted hoaxes do. It kept circulating for over a century, repeated by people who rarely explained why a single, unverified 1909 newspaper article kept resurfacing with this much persistence, generation after generation. A hoax doesn't usually need that much convincing to survive. This one apparently did, for well over 100 years. Whatever you make of the 1909 story on its own terms, the details people kept repeating map onto Enoch's account in a way that's difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Enoch describes an abyss, beyond the known world, no sky above it, no ground beneath it, defined almost entirely by what it lacks. The 1909 article describes a hidden chamber system beneath a canyon, sealed off, deliberately difficult to access, deliberately left unrecorded by the institutions supposedly involved. Two completely different eras, two completely different kinds of documents, an ancient religious manuscript and a sensationalist regional newspaper, landing on the same basic shape, something old, something sealed, something kept apart from the world above it on purpose, not by accident. This part rarely gets mentioned alongside the 1909 story, and it probably should be. Large sections of the Grand Canyon are officially off-limits to the public, and have been for a long time, not fenced off casually, but restricted under federal management, with some areas closed to research access entirely. The reasons given are almost always practical ones: erosion control, visitor safety, protection of fragile terrain. Nobody seriously disputes those stated reasons, but it does mean that a location repeatedly connected, rightly or wrongly, to a hidden chamber legend also happens to be one of the most heavily access-restricted natural landmarks in the entire country. True coincidence or not, that overlap is exactly the kind of detail that keeps a hoax alive 100 years after it should have quietly disappeared from public memory. Return to Enoch's own account for a moment, because it adds something the 1909 story never manages to explain about itself. Chapter 69 names a being called Casbiel, identified as the one who revealed the secret oath that keeps this kind of sealed place shut. The oath, the text specifies, was sworn before the events it was meant to contain had even taken place, the containment planned in advance of the very thing it was eventually built to hold. Taken at its own word, whatever is sealed at the ends of the earth in Enoch's account wasn't placed there as a reaction to some unfolding crisis. It was already accounted for, ahead of time, by whoever set the original seal. The 1909 newspaper story never offers anything close to that kind of explanation. It simply describes a discovery, with no account of who built what was supposedly found, or why it needed to be hidden in the first place. Enoch, oddly, is the only text in this entire comparison that even attempts to answer that question. If you're the kind of person who wants to know why a sealed place exists, not just that it supposedly does, hit subscribe and like this video before we finish. There's more of this comparative material still ahead in this series. And tell me in the comments, do you think the 1909 story borrowed its shape from older legends like Enoch's? Or is the overlap just coincidence? When the Council of Laodicea removed Enoch from Scripture in 364 CE, the recorded objections centered on the Watcher's narrative broadly, the fallen angels, the forbidden teachings, the unions with humanity, not on this specific passage about a sealed place at the world's edge. It was never individually examined in any surviving conciliar record, never directly refuted point by point, simply filed away under the same broad ban as everything else in the book. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed Enoch's cosmological material as unworthy of serious study, without engaging its specific claims. Augustine, writing in The City of God, argued that texts making this kind of detailed physical claim invited a level of scrutiny the church of his era wasn't equipped to control or contain. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, operating outside Rome's authority, kept the passage in its canon uninterrupted for over 16 centuries. The 1909 Grand Canyon story followed a stranger path of its own, dismissed almost immediately by the very institution it claimed involvement from, and yet never formally investigated closely enough to close the book on it completely. Two stories, separated by 17 centuries, both left sitting in the exact same unresolved condition, not disproven, simply never fully looked at. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe a Second Temple writer, reaching for the most vivid language available to him, happened to describe a sealed, empty, boundary-marking place in terms broad enough that any sufficiently mysterious location on Earth could eventually be mapped onto it, the Grand Canyon included, centuries later, by people who had never read a word of Enoch. Or maybe two very different eras, working from two very different kinds of evidence, kept independently arriving at the same underlying shape, something old, something sealed, something set apart from the world above it on purpose, not by accident, not by neglect. The seal in Enoch's account is still described as older than the thing it was built to seal. The 1909 story is still, formally, unexplained by the very institution it named. And the canyon at the center of all of it still holds sections no member of the public has ever been permitted to walk into. So I'll leave you with the question neither story ever quite resolves. If something really was sealed away at the edge of the known world, built to stay hidden long before anyone had the tools to go looking for it, what do you think it would actually take for a seal like that to finally be tested? Tell me what you believe in the comments. I read every one.